call this April meeting of the Budget, Capital, and Personnel Committee to order. Let the record reflect that we're all here. And let's see, we have minutes to approve. Start with that. Would anybody like to move the minutes of March 5th?
Sure.
Glenn moves, Rich seconds. Any discussion? Ready to vote? Okay, Mike.
Yes.
Martha.
Yes. I said yes.
Yeah, I said Glenn.
Oh, yes.
Rich.
Yes.
And I'm a yes, so that's unanimous. And let's see, then we have minutes for March 8th. Could I get a motion on those? Glenn moves, Martha seconds. Any discussion? Okay, ready to vote. Mike?
Yes.
Martha?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, so that passes unanimously. Changes to the agenda, we will be having a short executive session to discuss a particular employee. Good news this time, so stay tuned for that. Martha?
Deborah, you sent out draft goals earlier today. Did you want to
Yes.
talk about them?
Yeah, they're down. Discussion of committee goals is item 10. On
See it. All right. Thank you. I was looking under chair report. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So any other changes to the agenda? All right. Kathy, do we have any members of the public?
No, Deborah, we don't.
Okay, so we can move on to that. All right, County Administrator's report.
Thank you, Deborah. We have two things to report on. One is Amy has a draft of the employee survey we did a few weeks ago to kind of just touch on some of the high points of it, and then she'll be finalizing it and sending it out to the workforce in the next few weeks. But she can kind of give a brief update on some of the feedback we received, kind of a mid-COVID review of things, and then also Kevin and I have worked on a presentation on and kind of overview of the rollover policy, and kind of kick that discussion off with more follow-up in future weeks and months. But why don't I let Amy go first, if that's all right, Deborah? Hers is pretty short and sweet, and then we can get into the rollover discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jason.
All right. Well, I just wanted to give you guys some updates. We did a check-in survey with all of our staff. It was an electronic survey, but we also provided it in paper to those who couldn't receive it electronically, and it was also PDF. So if someone didn't want to do it online, they could provide it. We received 321 responses out of 721 employees at that time. So fairly good results. And we asked questions about how their work environment has changed, how they're changed in all of the different areas that they're working. I will say that, 51% of our respondents did say that they've experienced some increased stress over the last year. Probably not super surprising on that piece. But they also talked about a lot of other things that they are seeing. Over 80% of our employees also said that they feel supported by their supervisors. So we saw some really positive things, that they're feeling that they are getting the supports they need. We were able to also kind of look at that, and this report was done by the Climate Survey's engagement team. They're the ones that put it out there, and then they created some recommendations from it. So some of the recommendations and findings, things that they've learned is that, throughout the pandemic, we've learned that many roles can be filled in different ways than we had envisioned before. People are working remotely, and in some cases that works really well. And in some cases it doesn't. And so one of the recommendations from that finding is to look at how we do things as we start talking about people returning to the workplace. We also have discussed not calling it returning to work, because just because people weren't in an office doesn't mean they weren't doing work. And so it's return to the workspace versus returning to work. But they talked about, what does that look like? The other thing we found is that people were really innovative. We've been able to really look at different ways and different solutions of how we do the work. So things like telemedicine, it may not be for everyone, but it is for some people. And so some of that happened because of changes in state mandates and things like that. But that doesn't mean we can't advocate for some of those things to remain in place. Other places that we've experienced some of that innovation is like within the Department of Social Services, where they were able to shift how they do some of their business. So not everyone has to come on site all the time. So people that have childcare issues or are working may be able to check in via phone. Again, this was a change in a regulation, but it's working. So not losing that is another piece of what we learned from our employees. And then the last piece really talks about supporting health, wellness, and connection, and acknowledging that with all these shifts, remote meetings, those kinds of things, there has been a loss in connection. But there has also been some really interesting ways that our workforce has taken this on. So in some departments, they have kind of these break times where they meet via Zoom, not to discuss work, but just to check in on one another. And that they want to encourage that in the future, if they are on site or not on site, is having those check-in points. What used to be kind of water cooler conversations now are a little more well-intentioned. They know when they're going to occur, and building those breaks in, building time for physical activity. One of the things that we heard that people like about working from home is they have more time to do those physical things because they have less commute time. And, you know, Katie's not here, but she also encourages me anytime I talk about this. She said, what about greenhouse gas emissions from people not driving to work? So those kinds of things, you know, some of those unintended consequences of all these shifts. So overall, it was, you know, lots of ideas came from our employees, and we're summarizing it. And we'll have a draft of a document out to everyone in the near future.
Thanks, Amy. That's great. Yeah, I think that an experience like this really reminds us how meaningful those connections with our coworkers can be. We just take it for granted under normal circumstances. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Amy before we move on to Jason? Martha?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Could you remind me when you put the survey out there? What was the time period?
Yes, it went out, I believe, the first week of February, and it was out for 2 weeks for people to respond to. So yes, February 1st through February 12th.
Okay. And it's funny, we were talking about kind of this issue with our daughter just yesterday, and as she was saying, that what's really missed is those informal collaborations, those quick questions, that kind of connection. And we were talking about the county's choices of how to go back. Do we, like, do you, if people can work half time at home, do you have everybody like, you know, Monday to Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon to Friday, and so you have fewer desks you need? She said, well, that would be kind of maintaining the worst part of remote work. What you really want is at least some critical mass of time where people are shoulder to shoulder and people are bumping into each other in real life, in real time. So that the flexibility might be great, might be a plus for a variety of reasons, but we really kind of need to remember that it is critical to try to build in that time when in fact everybody is in the same building, the same office. So that made me think, okay, we probably really aren't looking at a massive reduction of office space as we get back. You know, you just can't, even things like if you share desks with somebody, people have different ergonomic needs. They have different height of the desk and the chair and the blah, blah, blah. So I really was thinking about it differently based on that comment. You really want people to rub shoulders.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of the survey showed, is there there is that need for those interactions. That doesn't mean that things can't shift, and people have different preferences. What we are starting to do with department heads, and I know we've mentioned that in our legislature updates, is bringing them together to discuss what they think is kind of the best method for their offices, because it looks different for every one of these groups. And with 27 different departments, there's different ways people interact, and there's different ways to do that. So I think you're right, Martha, that it doesn't mean reduce. We have to continue to look at the safety and what density is around the safety aspect, and then all of these other questions play into that as well.
Thanks, Amy.
Okay, anybody else? All right, then. Thanks, Amy. We'll look forward to seeing your official report. Jason.
Thank you. So I'm going to share a slide deck with you. Kevin did a great job in kind of summarizing. Let me start. The first thing we thought of doing is kind of sharing the policy of rollover versus the practice. And a next series of slides really looks at what the policy says and what the practice actually is. And from that, you'll be able to pull out some interesting differences. And Kevin did a great job of kind of synthesizing it all. And we've gone over it a few times. So I want to kind of go through those slides, share with you the differences of the two, and then kind of what options we have to move forward and kind of gauge some consensus for the group before we kind of go into a direction. But the short end of it is the practice is different than the policy. So if anything, I think at a minimum, we have to do some reconciliation of the two. And what direction that is yet to be determined. But let me share what I have on my screen here, and then we'll go from there. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
All right. That's not right. Is it the presentation mode or the slideshow?
It's the slideshow.
Okay, so it's a full slideshow?
No, it's like weird.
Okay, hold on a second. Sorry about that. Let me try it again. I've only done this, I don't know how many times. Let me get you up here. There we go. All right. Screen 2. Can you see that?
It says you're, yes, perfect.
The first, okay. So, no, Amy, we don't need to call Dominic. Thank you, though. That's her ripping on me. All right, let's go through this. So I hate, I don't like reading slide, every slide as it is, but there's some merit in it in this instance because we're citing the actual policy. But in short, the definition is to make use of excess funds from prior years, either in the current year or in the coming year. That's what rollover is. Expenditure side is where savings is, your expenditures is less than budgeted, and the revenue side is where you've received more revenue than budgeted, but that's on a selective basis. The funds come from both prior years, meaning multiple years where they accumulate, or from the last year, and we usually have what they call a certified rollover number. So for example, you could use it, and what we've done in the past is we could use it in the current year for purchases which you have approved through a separate process. You have a pretty extensive sheet that explains parts of it, or they come in forms of rollover OTRs into the following year or the succeeding year. Essentially, it is using fund balance. That's all rollover is fund balance. It's not anything else, but it's the same as fund balance. And we use an annual process to review this and make allocations or appropriations that the legislature approves. So key reminder is it's all fund balance. There isn't.
Jason, could you go back to that slide? Just that last.
Yep.
I was trying to listen to you and scan the.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks.
It's all fund balance. It's excess, funds from a prior year. The current year, meaning 2020, we suspended them, not knowing what the operating deficit was, and that actually kind of exposed some interesting components of the rollover policy. But we did use what we had from a 2019 certified rollover in the 2021 budgeted request. So we had a few rollover OTRs. Some people have expressed some interest in it, and we agree that the approach needs to be reviewed to understand the logistics between the practice and the policy, which are off. The fiscal policy, this is all in the fiscal policy online if you wanted to read it over. And it deals with section 4.06, reappropriation of unspent funds from previous years. Now, these are what we identified the three major intents of the policy. It provides the department head with flexibility to use funds wisely, regardless of arbitrary boundaries of the budget. It rewards efficiency, and it's intended not to create incentives for a use it or lose it spending mentality, meaning come year end, folks would intentionally purchase or expend funds that they may not need to expend. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the policy versus practice. The department heads have flexibility to use funds within the boundaries of their budget or budget years. And this is true for the most part, where they can use rollover that's accumulated over years to do certain things in certain years. The challenge that I think that we've observed from this, while it's a good liberty to have, it offsets or is used in a way that that offsets what should normally be part of a budget process. So, for example, a department would accumulate rollover, and then they would purchase a vehicle with that rollover. Well, irrespective of rollover policy, we should be purchasing the vehicle because it's an important function or important need and piece of equipment that the department needs. So, to a certain extent, structurally, the budget is reliant on rollover when it probably should be built into the structural budget. You know, a department needs a new set of wheels, so to speak. That should be part of the replacement process that happens every few years. If a department needs new computers, it should be dependent as to whether or not they have rollover to be able to expend those funds. It's something we should be outfitting that department with. Rewards efficiency. I don't know that I would agree with rewarding efficiency. A reward, it doesn't necessarily articulate in this context, meaning they don't benefit from it personally. Many times it's not due to a targeted investment or targeted interest. There's a reduction in expenditures for a variety of reasons. On the flip side of it, doesn't necessarily mean it's something that they intended to do or that they specifically did. Remember, if there was an intent or a direction that you should be, cutting costs by X amount every year, that's a different direction. In this case, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And it's a one-way street. So, for example, revenues are not necessarily or very seldom, or I should really say hardly ever impacted by a department head's actions. For example, the department head that generates the most revenue for you is Jay Franklin. He generates the most revenue. It's not that he does anything to generate that revenue, nor does he do anything that prevents the revenue from coming in. So while revenue plays a part of the rollover calculation, it's not necessarily anything we have any influence over. But many times can go into the calculation for rollover, but also depending on if it's, in this case, the past year negative, it penalizes the individual, which they may have no control over. Also, it creates incentive for a use it or lose it. Again, there's other, I guess it does create the incentive not to use it. I would question what is the directive or what's the policy directive that was given at the time or towards the end of the year that would suggest that there's that mentality out there. I haven't seen that, but maybe that's I think is a theoretical perspective, is that department heads would use it or lose it. The ownership of rollover, it's not really anybody's rollover, it's public taxpayers' money, and the rollover is a fund balance allocation that comes to that's used for purposes of reappropriation. So while the intentions, I think, are one thing, the actual practice is another. The number one on this in terms of unintended consequences, I think, is the bigger concern, in that departments, or however the process has evolved over time, are not going through the normal budget process to get needed equipment or purchases. Instead, they're using the intent, or they have the expectation that they'll be acquiring rollover to do purchases or expenditures that would normally be part of an operating budget. Policy versus practice. The policy has three types of rollover: use of anticipated current year surplus in the subsequent year's budget, use of previous year surplus funds in the subsequent year's budget, and reappropriation. We currently don't use the first section, section A in this, where we use anticipated current year-end surplus in future years, because we don't certify the rollover until year-end into the subsequent year, and we combine B and C into one process. So when we talk about using previous year surplus funds in subsequent years or the reappropriation, that's all done on the same time frame, which is usually around September, October, as we go through the budget process. Use of anticipated current year surplus in subsequent years. Again, we don't do this. Department doesn't identify funds that will not be spent in the current year and therefore request the funds be authorized into the next year. That doesn't happen. The only time that may happen is if we had a grant that isn't going to be expended this year and therefore needs to be carried into the future year. Again, B, this is what we normally, when we talk about using previous year surpluses in subsequent year, this is what we would call a rollover OTR when we have the certified rollover list, and we use it into an OTR in the upcoming year. And then the reappropriation. So the reappropriation is taking unspent funds from previous years and using them in the current budget year, which is submitted through a process to the legislature where you have a sheet that kind of explains some of the sources. In this instance, it identifies in the policy several unspent funds or categories of unspent funds, increase in state aid levels, single events that change in surplus, positions that remain vacant for longer than 6 months. And that's actually highlighted in red because we don't use that anymore to be calculated in the rollover. So that's, again, a policy statement that is no longer in practice. Fees charged to other departments, fees charged to the public. So these are all areas that can be used for reappropriations. Again, we combine this process usually into one process where they're being reviewed at the same time. We no longer use vacancies as part of the rollover calculation. The accounting for unspent funds is not exactly straightforward. So it's not simply tallying up just the savings. It involves netting out the savings where there's overages in certain areas and unders in other areas. And then prior year, the last bullet point has to do with folks where they acquire the funding through a grant in 1 year, but don't usually use all the expenditures in that year, and it has to then carry over into a following year. And sometimes if that reconciliation or budget adjustments aren't made in the prior year, it rolls into rollover. So it gives an inflated amount of rollover related to grant funds where expenditures would be in a following year. So this works, but it doesn't work consistent with the existing policy. External audiences, which is primarily accounting practices, the comptroller's office, and our auditors. Generally, everything we do should be consistent with GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting practices, and have the approval of our auditors. The comptroller's office has commented that this is not consistent with GAAP and shouldn't be recorded in the budget and financial statements. But Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, the only place that we identify rollover would be in restricted fund balance as opposed to unrestricted, correct?
There isn't a type of appropriated reserve that we do include the rollover, and that's the reserve that encumbers your next year's budget. So it kind of gets added in that big number for next year's budget, and we just tack rollover onto that. We bury it in the financial statements to the sense that we don't call out our rollover reserve so that anybody can really detect it. And we've done that so that we don't get comments on it for the financial statements. Where the state does find that we still have rollover, and they have complained about both our use of it and the way we accounted for it, was they go to a very tedious approach where they actually compare your budget with which Kevin submits to the state when you finally have an approved budget, and our AUD and our financial statements. And so they compare each of these three documents one with another. And because we do refer to it quite a bit in our budget document, they try to thread the needle and go down and find where this is in our budget. So we still have some inklings of rollover existing because they sense it and spot it in our budget, and then they cross-examine us to find out, well, where is this in your financial statements? So even though we've done a pretty good job of masking it in our financial statements, so we no longer get comments on it, it still kind of sticks out in our budget document, and then they want to see how we compare that to our financial statements. So, and like Kevin mentioned, either on this slide or another slide, yeah, right below here, we went from showing it as a negative expenditure in our budget document to a positive revenue. And that made some of the comments go away, but it still shows up in our budget document nevertheless. And sometimes we have 2 or 3 years go by and we don't get any comment. And when I say comment, I don't mean our auditor, I mean the state auditors who audit our AUD each year. And because at the end of each year, we always have a state auditor audit our AUD, and they normally come up with anywhere from 6 to 15 questions on our submitted document. And about every 3rd or 4th year, we get this comment on rollover, and then we try to explain our way around it. And at the end of the day, it's not a process or procedure that they've blessed, and it's not one that they like to see us go forward with, even though it doesn't really show up in your audited financial statements. Kind of gives you some background on it.
Thanks, Rick. Well, it's not, it doesn't come up as a material difference or anything on the financial statements. It's not exactly, it's not as transparent, I guess, as the process could be, or could be better. I mean, the fact that we have a policy is probably important, but the policy doesn't follow the practice. So there's some concerns just on a transparency perspective with the practice. From an accounting perspective, again, it should be transparent and maintained as part of our financial systems. And in this case, it's not. It's done outside of the financial system, meaning it's not part of the accounting system that Rick has, EFIN Plus. It's maintained and calculated outside of it. It's then handed off to the budget coordinator, which is Kevin, who maintains it in an Excel spreadsheet. And while it's identified as a restricted, or it's identified in the restricted reserve or restricted fund balance portion of the financial statements, it's not identified elsewhere, or it's not accounted for in the accounting system. It's accounted for in a side spreadsheet. And then ideally, workload should be comparative to reward in this case, or comparative to the amount of impact it has on the budget. Generally, rollovers, uses between $350,000 $650,000 requests on an annual basis, give or take a little bit. The amount of time and energy that Rick and then Kevin have to put into it to maintain it, then deal with the departments, that information that goes back out to the departments then have to give requests on it, have to then come back to us. We then have to review it with them. We then approve it, then goes through the legislative process, so on and so forth. It's a fairly labor intensive process for the small amount of budget impact that it has. The timing is not consistent as well in the policy. So the policy says that proposals must be submitted for approval prior to establishing fiscal targets, which would mean around this time as we go through the budget retreat process. And rollover would have to be available for procurement mid-year to meet current needs if you were to appropriate it this year. Obviously, that's not the case because finance doesn't certify it until the books are closed, which is usually around this time or within the month of April or May. And then the timing really comes, and use of it really comes along the mid-year or midpoint of when our budget season is the greatest, which is between June, July, and August. And then resolutions usually come out as through the EBC process if they're going to be using or requesting funds to be used in the current year, and then also to be used as part of the budget approval process for rollover OTRs. So the timing in the policy is not consistent with the practice. Fairness should be offered, benefits offered and requirements imposed by our system should be available and applied to all departments. This is only the general fund departments. It doesn't include all the enterprise funds. Revenues are a component, but not every department has revenues. So for example, assessment ITS really doesn't have a huge amount of revenues, where different departments may, and that may impact rollover calculations. Social services is an interesting beast. It's a difficult piece of the puzzle because you have a large revenue piece from the state, which is generally a lot of times a reimbursement of expenditures. And if at year end you do not do year end reconciliations where the modified budget are going to meet, or they're basically you're going to modify the modified budget to meet the actual expenditures, it then creates many times a negative rollover calculation because they have such a high revenue number that may come in well under that. So you have to constantly go through a reconciliation process to ensure that the rollover calculation is accurate and that you don't get this penalty, so to speak. And departments with rollover eligible funds are required to account for the source of funds, while those with negative rollover don't have the same scrutiny. That goes without saying that we generally don't report out on, or it hasn't been the practice of the county to report on negative rollover balances. So in this case, I'll use DSS for an example. DSS up until recently, where we reconciled a lot of it, they have to go through, they weren't going through not recalibration, but annual reconciliation of the revenue and expenditure lines at year end. So therefore, because they would receive less revenue than what was budgeted, which means they would also have less expenditures, they received a penalty on the revenue side of things. So they didn't necessarily reconcile. But we don't necessarily report out on negative rollover calculations. Process would utilize an accurate year-end totaling to determine department funds eligible for rollover, and the process would clearly and accurately present year-end position of departments. That's the policy, that's what it says. That does not necessarily happen. A lot of times finance works with departments to do year-end line item changes, which could be transferring within certain department lines to offset overages or overage or under parts of different department lines. And a lot of times there's transfers from contingency into those budget lines as well to balance them. So it doesn't speak to necessarily a clear picture as to departments that are over or under their budget. And when you put in revenue pieces to it, it even makes it even more, clouds it even more. And then again, when we talk about reporting on rollover balances, we generally don't report out on negative rollover balances. We only report out on ones that have balances. So it sidesteps one of the sections that we have in the fiscal policy, which was to report out on departmental deficits. There isn't a process in place that does that right now, but that's in the fiscal policy. Not a bad practice, but we don't have the structure currently to do that on an annual basis. So that's kind of a very quick and dirty version. I can send this out to all of you so you can review it again, because I'm sure you're really interested in learning more about it. But it kind of compares some of the basic practices versus where the policy is. And there's definitely disconnects with them. Where do we go from here is probably several points of discussion. One, don't do anything. We can keep it as is and continue to have the differences between the policy and the practice. So you can adopt the approach to match the policy, which I think would be near impossible to do, just from a timing perspective and some other elements. You can change the policy to adapt to the practice. You could throw out the whole thing, or we could probably, which is what we're recommending, is perhaps maybe gather some more information from department heads as to why they feel this is valuable and not valuable, and then look at the current practice to see if there is a reason to continue a similar type of policy that has a similar type of outcome, but can be done in a much more efficient way that is also consistent with best accounting practices. And that's as Rick and Kevin and I have talked about this over the past few weeks. A lot of department heads, use this in good nature, and some use it in situations which I don't think it was intended to. That's not to discredit them, but for example, I'll give you an example. A department uses it for influxes in expenditures that coincide every few years for certain routine but cyclical expenditures that come about based on their departmental needs. Banking on or depending on rollover to be able to do that really shouldn't be dependent on whether or not they provide that service, because they have to provide that service. It's a functional need of that department. And rollover has morphed into this type of process where it probably should just be a one-time OTR when that increase happens every few years based on their operational need. that's just the end of the presentation. It was really a quick and dirty on the policy versus the practice. And like I said, I'll send it out to everyone after this presentation. But I think our recommendation for next steps are to share this with you, have you mull it over, think about it over the course of the next month, and then probably shoot out some survey questions to department heads about the use of rollover, why they, do they find it valuable? Is it helpful? We probably can come up with about 5 questions that will be meaningful, that will help inform some decision making as to whether or not we want to continue the practice, continue it as is, continue it with changes, or discontinue it. I guess I turn over to Kevin and Rick. Do you have anything else to add to this before we open it up?
I just have one comment. I like the way we ended with the different 4 or 5 alternatives on ways you might want to go forward with this. I think we need to add one more thing before we have our next discussion, and we don't have to answer it today, and that is how Jason and Kevin and I left the last meeting when we were meeting on this together, is what do we want this policy to do?
Yeah.
What is the main goal or function that we would hope this policy achieves? Because at this point, that is not even clear. And I would like to have that established first, and then I think maybe all the rest might start to be able to be implemented.
Thanks, Rick. That's a really excellent point. And thank you, Jason and Kevin, for your hard work. Yeah, we do probably need to see this presentation, have it sent to us, not because we find it scintillating, but because it's not all that easy to understand. So I have questions from Rich, Martha, and Mike Lane.
Okay. It seems like there's some real benefit to having this policy in some form. I've certainly been in organizations with budgets where it's a spend it to save it. And this seems far preferable. Whether it's where it needs to be, I think getting the input from the department heads would be really useful for us. So I'll stop there.
Martha?
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Jason and Kevin. I appreciate this thoughtful look at this. You mentioned grant management, and but I didn't seem to fit into your categories where a grant, you get a grant in September and the money comes through in December and then you don't spend it in a full year. Where is that in your calculation?
That can cause problems in the rollover process. It can sometimes, depending on, if department heads are proactive, they can carry it over. They can do budget adjustments into the following year, depending on how much has been expended into one year, could determine if there's accrued revenue that may be accounted for the prior year based on when it's received. Grants can also not be reconciled, and if the funding is received in one year, but expenditures carry over to another, it could be rolled over into a rollover calculation, which is not what you want. So it's one of those things that needs to, that can be addressed several ways, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. I don't know, okay. Kevin and Rick, did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, in Martha's question, it happens both ways. A lot of departments are proactive and want to make sure in the first 3 months of the subsequent year that they get their grant reapplied to the next year's budget. So they do the resolution, which you're all familiar with. And then I have to back it out of the rollover calculation. Manually have to go through each and every department to find out how many, if any, resolutions they did that re-awarded grants to the new year. On the other hand, don't do it, then it falls into rollover.
I would encourage us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think if the policy is cumbersome because of the kind of thing you're talking about, like 99.9% of grants are not going to be contained in a budget, in a calendar budget year. So this is like always going to happen. So that's a particular piece. Let's figure out a more streamlined way of accounting for that.
Kevin, do you have a question? Kevin, you had a question on that? Or
Yeah, I
statement?
wanted to say that what happens now, and it's perfectly in keeping with policy, is that departments will reappropriate money right the next thing into the new year, thus stepping outside of the rollover, making the rollover policy irrelevant because they're reappropriating outside of it rather than having to wait until September to get that money. So there's
Okay.
there's no baby in that bathwater.
What I mean, it
just
sounds like
bathwater.
it sounds like it's piled on to the reasons some people don't like rollover. I think we can manage that. We will always have grants that cross calendar years. So I'm also puzzled. We used to, and not that long ago, we used to have all the rollover requests come in June. I remember like many years of looking at rollover requests in June, and some would get appropriated current year and some would be like intended for the following year. So I don't know what happened to our processes, but until recently it used to be done in June, May or June. Okay, I'll just put that out there. A lot of years, it's how we did it. I really think we need to ask department heads what this would, what it should look like. Sort of the most compelling argument to do something different is how much labor is involved in managing up to $650,000 worth of dollars in that request. So that, I'm sympathetic with that. That seems like a lot of work per dollar. But I would agree with Rich. I think that we should figure out how to make it more efficient, how to make it less clunky, but it serves a really important function. And for example, when you mentioned, Jason, about like some expenditures don't come up every year, you don't want to be charging taxpayers on a target basis for something you're only going to buy every 3 years or every five years. And so, and I don't know how, if there's a way to, like if it's the equipment budget and people have, let's say you $100,000 to buy a vehicle, you put into your target $20,000 every year and that sort of sits somewhere, or do you every 5 years have to add $100,000 to what we charge taxpayers? I think
it doesn't matter whether it's a rollover use or whether it's
Or a one-time OTR.
it's all the same money. So I mean that's I agree with you. You wouldn't increase target based on that. You would address it based on those needs. So in that case, if it's a vehicle once every 3 years or 5 years, you would use a one-time OTR because it's part of your equipment replacement program.
so. Then it's a question of which, from the department head point of view, I might be more nervous about getting my OTR approved than about being able to be thoughtful and plan ahead and know that I'll have rollover to apply to that occasional expense. So I guess that's
I would question that with, as an organization, if this is an operational need, there shouldn't be a concern as to why the request is coming in. When you have departments that say, well, I don't know if I can get a vehicle replacement, so I'm using rollover. To me, that's a structural budget problem. To be honest with you, that should be something we should address. Not that I'm using rollover because at the end of the day, it's the same money coming from the same place. But it's a mentality.
I'm just saying, when I've been here in years when the only way to get through a budget season was to cut out all equipment expenditures. And, even though, eventually you're going to have to buy that equipment, the only way to get to a target we could live with was to eliminate equipment. And then people started using rollover to pay for it. So, all right, those are some of my thoughts. Thanks. I look forward to hearing what department heads say. Thank you.
Mike?
I would have.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rick. Did you have something?
Yeah, on the biggest complaint that I've heard already on if rollover went away, because we've discussed it with departments over the last couple of years, this is no secret, that it could be changed or it could be morphed into another policy, or it could go away. The biggest complaint is, well, that's how I get all my computers. You know, I always plan to get my computers out of that, get that extra vehicle out of that, which Jason alluded to. But what they're failing to think about is that if there were no rollover, we always have the option of a department coming forward and making a contingency fund request, as we get almost every meeting for one thing or another. And we always have that option of department heads submitting their extra need or the unthought of thing that they have to purchase through a regular contingency fund budget adjustment. We always have, and I want the legislature to know that this would always be an option for departments to come forward and say, here's what I need mid-year.
So what you're saying is you'd rather have them come on an ad hoc basis, some in the middle of the year, we don't know how to plan for it, versus they're planning on a multi-year basis when they say, I know I'm going to be able to save up for this equipment and I'll get it 2 years or 3 years from now. I
have to say, I think that this kind of extended debate on this point is premature until we hear from the department heads on
fair enough.
Their preferences are. So if we could, Mike, what did you have?
Thank you. I think this policy was initiated back in the late 1990s originally. It's been no secret, I've opposed it every year ever since. A couple of things, and I want to thank you for this presentation. It was wonderful to have it side by side and the way it was set up carefully. Congratulations on the three of you for putting this together, because it gives us something to look at seriously. This is the first time I've heard that the state auditors criticized our rollover policy. That's kind of important, but I've never heard it before. I always characterized the rollover policy as a spending policy. It simply allowed every nickel to be spent. Now that was changed slightly I think around the time of the recession, when they could no longer plan on savings from personnel vacancies, for example, being part of rollover. How many times have I heard, well, we called up that department and told them they've got X number of dollars in rollover, which says to me that they aren't always aware of what the rollover situation is. We've had some departments, and of course the argument from day one was always, this will be better planning and they will be able to, if they know they can make certain adjustments and have this money available in the future, that will make better planning. And that's happened in some places. I think of one very influential department head in a small department who did a wonderful job trying to maneuver and have that, but it's not always that way. I guess my question becomes, and I've asked this before, and thank you for putting it in this presentation. It says no other counties have this policy. And I knew that. And not only do no other counties have it, but I don't know any other municipality anywhere that has it. And I've asked the question. I've asked that of county administrators and have been unable to find anybody that has anything similar to this. If we change it substantially, if we do away with it, then what we have to do is have an alternative so that the department heads don't think you're just taking away all of their planning opportunities here. They are good people who do their best for the county, but they have to know that we have their backs when they need it. But the county budget is a budget of the legislature. It is not a budget of the departments. We represent the county taxpayers, and we look to the department heads to plan their budgets in accordance to our requests and approval. So I think that if we offer them a new process where they don't feel that they've just been stranded, I think it would make a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Glenn, you've been pretty quiet. Do you have anything to offer on this before I speak?
No,
Okay.
very interesting conversation.
Yes. Yeah, I second Mike's comment. It was really an eye-opener to see this stuff compared side by side. I've not been a fan of this policy because my perception is that the unintended consequence of ownership is a phenomenon that you have to deal with, not just with the department heads' perceptions, but with some of the legislators. I mean, I know speaking with my colleagues at times about things, they'll say, oh, well, it's coming out of rollover, so that's okay. And it's not. I mean, to me, planning aside, as Jason points out, when somebody says, my department needs this, we ought to be looking at their department and saying yes or no, your department does need it or doesn't need it. And if your department needs it to do the job, we should be providing the money so that they can have it. So to me, the only legitimate purpose this policy ought to be serving is to prevent the use it or lose it phenomenon. And I think that there are other ways we should be doing this. I mean, part of our evaluation of the performance of any department head should be, do they make good and efficient use of county resources? You know, if they're spending profligately at the end of the year on some bright, shiny object that turns out to not be a good purchase, that reflects, to me, on their performance as a department head. So I guess taking the grant piece out of it, because it sounds to me like there are better ways to account for the problems with grant funding. What we really ought to be looking at is how to make sure that department heads are using their funding effectively, and how to make sure that when they really need a one-time capital expense, we're willing to give it to them as a one-time OTR. So I guess all that being said, I would certainly support the idea that we go back to the department heads and ask them, you know, how can we accomplish these things? And assure them that if they need something, we want to give it to them. Okay, so Martha.
Thanks. Yeah, that really is as I understood it, the purpose that it went into place for in the first place. So to your question, Rick, that's my purpose. How can we encourage planning, discourage frivolous, deadline-oriented spending? And by the way, if there's some sort of a deadline and the three of you have to review all these requests on December 25th or whatever, that won't make for, great holidays.
Well, that's just not a good system.
Well, I'm saying if expenditures have to be made by the end of the year, any sort of approval process, I don't know if that's gonna really make sense. So the idea of encourage planning, prevent use it or lose it. Those are the real purposes here. And I agree with Mike. I'm surprised if this really was a problem in our audit evaluations. I would have surprised we haven't heard about that before. So I would like to see department heads really be encouraged to think about what are the best ways to save the benefits of this and reduce the unfortunate consequences of the policy.
Yeah, and I do agree with Mike. I find it I find it disturbing that this isn't consistent with GAAP. I mean, that makes me uncomfortable. So anyhow, so we've spent the better part of an hour on this topic, and we will spend more time on it as the year goes by, but let's move along.
I could just say two things. One, I think that's the biggest concern is the accounting piece to it and the transparency part. So I think as we look forward, if there's alternatives, we're going to want to make sure that everything is on board with best practices and accounting practices moving forward. I think to me that, you know, the workload piece is a huge part of it too, but I think the transparency piece and the accounting practice is a big part of it. The other thing I just want to say is that I did absolutely very little work in this presentation. This was all Kevin being able to recite policy for practice. So he deserves the real thanks in being able to lay it out in easy to read terms. I just rambled through it. He did all the heavy lifting. So good job, Kevin.
We always love Kevin.
That's all I got.
Okay, great. So Rick, what have you got for us?
I have a mortgage recording tax update for you. Because it only happens twice a year, because that's when we distribute the money to the municipalities, the local mortgage recording tax, which goes to them, is only measured and brought to your attention every 6 months. So here we are at the end after March 31st and at the end of the semi-annual period. So I thought I'd give you the numbers on how we did this last 6 months from October through March 31st. The part that goes to the municipalities that I distribute was $1,106,000. Last year at this same time, it was $961,000. So we had an increase over the previous year of $145,000, which is 15.1%. So even with COVID, and I think Maureen Reynolds has brought this forward a number of times, how mortgage recording tax was not affected so much by COVID. This is a good signal, and this is a good sign that one of our sources of revenue, the MRT, actually increased over the last 6 months compared to 1 year ago. I thought you should know that. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Rick. It's nice to have good news.
You're welcome.
Okay, any questions for Rick? All right, thank you. I'm going to put off my committee report till we talk about committee goals. Henry, did you have anything for, oh, I'm sorry, Martha?
Yeah, there's the budget request, year-end budget transfer, packet page 13. I don't know the rules on, do we have to vote on, this is a fairly large amount. Do we have to vote on these? Or is this just information only?
No, it's information only.
Okay, thanks, Kathy.
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Martha. Henry?
Yes, the WDIC committee has not met because we meet every 2 months. And so, but we're meeting at the end of April, and we'll talk about the Juneteenth celebration that is being planned for us. We don't know what it's going to be, but we're planning it. We'll also probably talk about the Asian Pacific Islander month, which is the month of May. And we'll also talk about committee goals.
Okay, any questions for Henry? All right, Henry, next time, I can't keep track of WDIC's schedule on top of everything else, but next time you guys haven't met, you know, just shoot me an email. You don't have to sit through this if you don't want to.
It's okay,
Thanks.
but I will shoot you an email.
All right, great.
Thanks.
All righty. So, report from Ms. Ruby Pulliam.
Hi, thank you. I'll be very short. We're submitting an information item for budget transfer for $4,800 for computer equipment. If there were any questions about that, I could answer. Okay. Personnel updates, the deadline for the CSO position was yesterday. We're looking at 12 approved applications, and we'll be starting the review this week. The Deputy Workforce Development Director, the deadline was extended to the 16th, which is this week. And so far we have 5 approved, 5 incomplete. And Rick, we've talked about it before, your payroll specialist, we have 5 approved and 4 incomplete as of now. Your deadline is the 17th. And that's pretty much it for now, short and sweet.
Thanks, Ruby. I was going to ask you about the finance positions. So it's good to hear.
Right. We're getting ready to post the purchasing manager as soon as we get the paperwork from the county admin's office.
Well, it'll be really good to have that up. Martha.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Ruby. I know it's on one of the committee goals that's recommended here. Review demographics of county workforce overall and develop baselines. Are we, how close are we to getting a report that we could take a look at?
We're working on that with the Workforce Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I think, Henry, we were giving you a report in May, starting in May with Henry's report and then factoring that on out. So the full legislature should have that in May as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mike?
Maybe I should ask this of Rick, but Rick, is there another position in your department that we're about to hire on, or what's going on? Ruby or Rick?
The purchasing specialist has been out there for a few weeks, and we have 5 applicants for that right now, thereabouts.
Yeah.
And we'll begin interviews for that immediately. We have some good candidates. The purchasing manager position is a new position that's beefed up from the buyer position, and that's been reviewed, and we're just waiting approval on that. We're ready to post that maybe even today or tomorrow. And the third position is temporarily filled. It's a finance payable position that with restructuring staff, we still have Linda Halstead here on board, who has floated from one position to another over the last 3 or 4 months. And she's filling that position temporarily until that position is permanently hired.
So there's 3 in play then, right?
There's 3 in play, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Martha?
Yeah, I understand the existing right now at the One Stop Center, we have an interim director. And I don't know, is there a plan for a final hire or appointment or whatever?
The One Stop, I'm not familiar with that. With the Office of Employment and Training?
No, it's
Career Center.
the Career Center. Not
Jackie.
the Workforce Development Program.
Jackie.
Yeah.
We haven't done anything as far as that. I believe it's waiting on testing.
Yeah, it's a competitive position, so we have to wait for the test to be given.
That's why she's interim.
Okay, all right. Do we have a date on that?
No, we don't. No, we don't.
Love civil service. All right.
Okay, and then the other piece of this is that Ruby and I have been in communication about the direct report surveys. We're working on them. And we hope to get them out by the end of this month.
Yes.
So, all right. Anything else for Ruby? All right then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Okay, we have a resolution authorizing.
Deborah, could I just make a comment? I'm sorry, I've been struggling here to be heard here, my fault. I just want to say that I know we've had some issues with our direct report process here the last 2 or 3 years, but it's still a huge step forward compared to what we used to have. And I think our Human Resources Department is responsible for helping us move this ahead, and I want to thank them for that.
I do too. Ruby's been super to work with and very proactive about maybe narrowing our questions and making our inquiries a little more focused. So we can continue to improve on our process. All right, so we have a resolution, document ID 9963, authorizing the use of contingency funds to support the cost of short-term rental monitoring and analytics. Would somebody like to move that? Rich moves it and Martha seconds it. And Nick Helmholt is here to explain it.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, so a bit of background on this. This project started out as a initiative in the shared services plan as a partnership between the county and municipalities to help monitor and understand the short-term rental market. This is basically residential properties that are being used for short-term stays under 30 days, typically on platforms like Airbnb or VRBO, or there's several dozen others. After we did an RFP that was issued back in November to see who was out there that would be willing to do this, I got 4 responses. You'll see there in the memo listed. We had a committee made up of joint county staff and municipal representatives to review those responses and score them. We invited the top 2 scoring firms to do interviews over Zoom, of course, and talked through some of the questions. What it really came down to was a bit of a cost competitiveness. The features and benefits of the 2 platforms seemed pretty similar. So it really came down to a price decision sort of at the end of the day, which led us to recommend the LTAS Technologies option. The idea here is that this technology allows us to have a really clear view of where short-term rentals are happening and to make sure that they're in compliance. So from the county's perspective, the main issue we're interested in is room tax compliance, making sure that folks are registered with the county, that they're current on those taxes. From the town's perspective, it's both ordinance development and ordinance enforcement. So some towns and villages have existing processes. They have existing ordinances for short-term rentals. I think Dryden just passed one, and Village of Cayuga Heights has passed one. But several other towns are considering it, including the city of Ithaca. So this information can help inform their decision-making as they go down the road on this topic. So that's why it's, part of our overall shared service plan, and something that we look, if it's successful, we will find a way to build into future years. So we're asking for funding here for the first year through the contingent fund, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I've got questions from Glenn and Martha.
Thank you. Nick, is this a yearly cost at $11,200?
This is a 1-year subscription cost. Yep.
So next year will be another $11,200. Will the room tax cover the cost?
I would look to, once we get this up and off the ground, I'd like to talk with our partners and figure out where the spread of properties are, and maybe think about a partnership between municipalities and then potentially having the balance coming out of room tax. So it's in development. It's going to depend a little bit on what the data shows.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Martha and then Rich and then Mike. Put his hand down.
Nick, wouldn't it be more is there a first year higher cost compared to like maintaining it every year? It seems like the first year you go through and develop the addresses. In future years, it would seem probably less expensive to just review and update. No?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. So there's the websites that are doing this, are proliferating. So there's a service side of keeping up with all of the new listings that are out there. And then there's also, people are moving between platforms. So there are some legitimate needs that will have to be considered, every year. I will say, when looking at the cost competitiveness of this firm versus some of the competitors, this was a flatter trajectory than some of the other ones.
Okay. And remind me, I'm pretty sure Governor Cuomo put into his executive budget that rentals were going to have to pay sales tax as well as this kind of room tax. Did that get in the budget? Do you know?
Did not make it into the budget. There is a bill, I believe, either in the Senate or Assembly that tends to do something along those lines for just upstate. I don't know if that's going to have any traction for the remainder of this session.
Okay. And when do you think we would expect to get a report from these folks?
Yeah, I think, we can, as soon as we get under contract with LTAS, they I think signaled about 2 to 3 weeks to start collecting data. They need a little bit of information from us to start to set up their systems. So I would expect, certainly this summer would have some information to share.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick.
Rich.
Thanks. I think this is a great idea. I will vote in support. My sense is that there's a lot of rentals that are not reporting. And what I've heard in terms of the summer rental market on the lake, the weekly rental prices are shocking. And I think if we captured a very small percentage of that, to Glenn's question, I think we'd pay for this pretty quickly, but we'll see. But I'm very curious what we find out. Thanks.
That's interesting information, Rich. Thanks. I would hope going forward, we aren't footing the entire cost of this so-called shared service. Or if we are, it's coming out of the room tax.
Yeah, that's my intent as well. This is a one-time jumpstart expense, and then future years would be divvied up other ways.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Are we ready to vote? Okay, Mike Lane.
Yes.
Martha.
Yes.
Rich.
Yes.
Glenn.
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Thank you, Nick.
Very good. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Okay, so the next thing we've got is an authorization to reimburse the town of Dryden for a local share of bridge replacement costs for the South George Road over Virgil Creek, ID number 10004. Can I get somebody to move that? Mike, are you moving? Mike's moving, Rich is seconding. Who wants to speak to this? Mike?
Just want to point out that this was discussed and was passed in the F&I committee last month.
Okay, and I gather this is pretty standard?
No, it's not standard, actually.
Oh, really?
Because the whole bridge project was not standard. Normally, the bridge money comes to the county, we build the bridge, and then we charge the town for the local share, or whatever town it is. In this case, we were able to secure money for more bridges through the Bridge New York program by the town applying for it. And therefore, it makes sense for us, because it's a savings for the county, it'll be a county bridge, to reimburse the town. And that's what this is about.
That's even better.
There'll be another Bridge New York grant request, and I know our highway department is also already talking to some of the towns about putting in requests again for this, on top of the ones we're going to put in.
Well, that's great. It sounds like we would have a better chance of getting more awards. Thanks. Martha.
Yeah, thanks. At the same time that Dryden got the award, Bridge New York award for this bridge, the Freeze Road Bridge was in there as well. As y'all know, it's probably know, it took longer to get the design settled. And they're working with the state and the Federal Highway Authority as well, Federal Highway Administration on settling the final design and the costs. But my understanding, I've gotten recent data from Dan Lamb of the town board, is that there will still be either a savings or about a wash from the original projection. So I trust and hope the same reimbursement schedule will pertain to Freeze Road and to any other Bridge New York bridges that come through town actions, because the towns do have to apply, or at least they did in this case. They've done all the work. And I think the least we can do is reimburse them theirs, because they've saved us millions of dollars by doing this. So.
And that's why Dryden's the crown jewel of Tompkins County, right?
Well, may I just say that the Freeze Road Bridge reimbursement will be much more controversial.
And so we'll be saving millions of dollars for the county, even if we reimburse them the original projected local share.
Okay, well, let's save that little kerfuffle for the appropriate moment. We ready to vote on this one? All right, Mike.
Yes.
Martha.
Well, I was thinking about adding a whereas or a resolve that said that the county will follow the same pattern on other Bridge New York projects, but I'll just vote yes at this moment.
That's a wise choice, Martha. Rich.
Yes.
Glenn.
Yes.
And I'm a yes. All right, so the last one is Chief Sustainability Officer budget and position transfer from admin to DPS. Jason, did you want to speak to this one?
I think this is the trifecta, this resolution. I think it's gone to 3 different committees, or will have gone to 3 different committees. This is originally, when the OTR was put together, the position was thought to be located in county administration. After talking with Katie, Ruby, Lisa, we felt, and Arel, we felt it was best located in DPS, just due to the relationship to the similar type projects that they work on. So this is just shifting that budget into theirs, from my budget into planning.
Yeah, I had that deja vu sense when I saw this.
Yeah, this is the 3rd or the 4th one, I think.
Okay, does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, then let's vote on this one. Mike.
Yes.
Deborah, was there a motion? I'm sorry.
I thought we did.
I can't remember. Oh, now there is. Rich moved it. And Glenn seconded it. And Mike voted yes. And Martha?
We just forgot.
Thank you.
I'm a yes.
Okay, Rich.
Yes.
Glenn.
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Okay, so we'll see this again at the full legislature meeting, Jason, at which point we can all recite it by heart.
Yes. We should know it by heart by now.
All right, so that's it for our resolutions, and now we can move on to our discussion of committee goals. Let me just say, as sort of part of my chair's report, as I mentioned, the first goal was to complete the direct report evaluations prior to starting the budget process. Ruby and I have already gotten the ball rolling on that. Review the rollover policy was another one, and Jason and Kevin and Rick have already gotten us rolling on that. And let's see, Martha, you had mentioned that you wanted us to review the results of that post-COVID employee survey. And Amy's already started rolling the ball on that. So we're going great guns here. Do we want to talk about the rest of these? Jason, did you have your hand?
I can add one thing. Amy is working with departments to really go through the RBA process with them. We found that there's been some shortfalls in prior years, so she's really spending a lot of time working with different departments on updating their RBA process and really, incorporating it into collecting meaningful data for meaningful outcomes. And so I would just say that's in process, and probably in 2 or 3 months, she'll have a good update as to where she is with things with them.
Okay. All right, Martha.
Thank you, Deborah. This is a great list. I really appreciate seeing it all in one place. The third one about the net position before we, in accounting for COVID expenses and revenue losses, et cetera, getting ready for the ARP conversation and rescue plan. Jason, can you talk about that a little bit? And in particular, in counting staff time, where we haven't actually spent extra dollars on staff, but staff got redirected to COVID responsibilities.
Yep.
How do you figure that? How do you account for that?
The short answer is I don't know yet. To be honest with you, I think, one of the things we're going through the process right now is understanding what expenses we've had. I would say hard expenses versus soft expenses. Hard expenses meaning dollars out the door. Soft expenses meaning staff time. That may look at, all right, how much did you expend dollar-wise towards it you aren't going to get reimbursed? So that, I think we can, within reason, try to estimate ranges for that. Time, is lost productivity. It's not hard dollars out the door, but it's time that they're not spending doing other things. So we can determine how we want to calculate that or use that number. But that also may play into receiving or qualifying for expenses for reimbursement under the stimulus program as well. And that's yet to be determined as to how those expenditures can be used to claim funds from for the stimulus package. So I think they're going to commingle at some point in time, and how we want to, if we're looking at just the financial position, the use of staff time directed towards another purpose is not going to come up in your net, financial statements. That's not going to come out that way, but it comes out in other ways. So I mean, we'll just have to understand it all and make a determination as to how you want to interpret it.
So do you mean that we will be eligible for certain reimbursements for staff time, and you have to figure that? So even if there's an opportunity cost because health department staff didn't do something else, we're going to get reimbursed maybe for some of that time. So that's.
So I caution you on that only because the guidelines are changing. So let's say a redirect, let's say a staff that was wholly committed to response may, depending on the circumstances, we may be able to get that money reimbursed. That's one circumstance. Mm-hmm. So in that case, it may be a net gain because other than the person, we had budgeted the salary for that person. They were paid, but they were doing other work. So we actually might have a net gain. There's also circumstances where expenditures were put out the door that aren't going to be reimbursed at all. So there's a net loss. And then there's, hopefully everything like testing is all a wash for us, right? So to kind of map those out, it will be difficult. We'll be able to do it, but the unknown is, we don't know what we may get reimbursed for staff time that was redirected. It's a moving target right now a little bit. So, we've got some decent records. We've got to look through, and I think we've got to, over the next 30 to 60 days, kind of put it all together, package it all together, and share with this committee, what we think is going to be reimbursable, what we don't think is going to be reimbursable, what's the net impact, net loss. That's going to continue, in the future months. I would say probably at least to the end of this year, one way or another. There's going to be lingering expenses that may not be reimbursable. There's going to be redirected staff time that may or may not be reimbursable. So that's one thing. And then the actual stimulus reimbursement is staff time that could be contributed. That could be a different series of reimbursements. So when you talk about understanding net position, there's the net position of the budget, and then there's the impact of the actual COVID response. And it will be delayed, right? So reimbursement's not going to be prompt. It's going to be corrections. It won't be clean.
Right.
I'm just prefacing you for that right now.
No, I totally, I understand. So, but we're going to have to make decisions on the American Rescue Plan relatively quickly, aren't we probably going to have to decide well before the end of the year how that money gets?
Yeah, you can. I mean, the way, what we've heard, which isn't anything new, it could be anywhere from lost revenue. It could be projects that were not done as a result of, it could be COVID-related expenses. I mean, it's almost, it's a very, right now, it seems like it's a very, very wide net of things that can fall underneath this. And, we have to be sure not to overlap expenditures. We have things that can be qualified for one, shouldn't qualify for the other, that type of thing. So it's really difficult to say without that guidance out there. But, I've heard anywhere from capital projects that were postponed to revenue that was lost to COVID-related expenditures that don't qualify for reimbursement. I hate to say I don't know, but I don't know.
I don't perceive that it's this enormous rush that we have to decide by the end of the year, because we have until December of 2024 to spend the money we get under the ARP. Is that right?
I don't know the exact, I know it's a few years difference. I mean, I don't know exactly. Again, I just don't know without that guidance into what it can be used for. I mean, there's also a component that it can be used to stimulate the economy. So how you can redirect the funding and turn it around as a whole, that's a different approach and different use of the funds than gaining reimbursement for lost revenue, right? I mean, they're very vastly different purposes. So how it's all kept, I just don't know how they're gonna coordinate that.
Right. I guess I thought I heard somewhere, not sure it was confirmed, that you had to spend or at least encumber the first half of it, almost 10 million for us before you could encumber or before you would get the second half.
I heard that as well, Martha. That's what I heard probably a few weeks ago. I think it was a NISAC. It might have been Senator Schumer's briefing that was said.
So I know there's a lot that's still unknown. The second to last, so I look forward to that conversation.
Yeah.
Second to last budget, a bullet, review employee wages of county contractors and consider whether to require a living wage. I thought we do.
You do. I mean, you don't require it, you encourage it. And I would say the vast majority, if not all of them are, with the exception of some of the human service contracts, because they're probably predicated on reimbursement through Medicaid.
So we can't set any.
You can, but you're going to essentially knock out certain contractors, because if they have to pay a living wage, they would be doing it at a loss.
Rather gets Medicaid reimbursement for therapists.
You're going to be compensating the increase. You're going to be paying for the increased cost.
Well, you could set a policy that would make exceptions as well. It doesn't have to be an across the.
I think most of your contractors are.
Consider part.
I think we had this discussion maybe 2 years ago where almost nearly all of your contractors are paying a living wage.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. And I just want to stress that, this is not just the work of one committee. I mean, we can certainly kind of figure out how much our delta is at the end of all this. And having determined that, figure out how much of this ARP money is quote unquote disposable. But determining how to spend it is going to be the work of several committees. I know that Martha's HUD committee is going to probably have a massive role in all of this. And sadly, Rich, I read the NISAC summary of the enacted budget, and the provision for shared jails is not in the bill. So I guess we're in a position now where we have to figure out what we're going to do with our public safety buildings. So that's another issue. I noticed that the ARP bill has billions of dollars in it to help people who have rent arrears and utility arrears. The state's enacted budget has added another $100 million to that. I don't know how much we're going to get locally for that purpose, but certainly if there's a big chunk of money coming from Washington and Albany for that, that's less money that the county has to spend for that purpose. I know that's a concern of yours, Martha. I also noticed in the NACO summary that there are certain organizations to which we can transfer some of our art money if they're not for profits that perform a governmental service of some sort. I had sent Jason some questions I had about the ARP, and included in that was, what kind of organizations might be eligible transferees. Obviously, he can't know that until we get the guidance from Treasury. But, it occurred to me that that might be something that might allow us to help out TC3, for example. Although Martha sent us an email this morning that said TC3 is going to be getting about $4.5 million. Now, I don't know, Martha, and I don't know if you know, whether that's restricted, whether that's money they're going to get automatically or it's available to them if they apply for it and show that they're eligible. That's certainly something that we could take up in Tiger and ask Amanda Spellisy or Allison Hunt or, some of our other contacts. My guess is the Cornell people will know a lot about that.
Yeah, and it looked like community colleges in particular have more than one way to access money. So I think we have to sort of assume that each of the entities that are identified specifically, like airports, like transit, like community colleges, are gonna dig into their own pockets and figure out what they're eligible for, how to apply, et cetera. For example, like for the emergency rental assistance, I assume DSS will really be responsible and figure out how we enroll people and what the criteria are. But when you mentioned, other entities that we can transfer dollars from, specifically, I think in the language that I've read, it is meant to be able to support economic development and rebooting our local economy. So they specifically mentioned tourism and leisure activities because that's the industry that of all of them might have really been impacted the worst. So I'll be interested in trying to understand how we could do that, what that would look like. And in other conversations, I've used your example, Deborah, of, the restaurants on Aurora Street, half of them are gone. I'm like, oh no. So what can we do? And I think the intention of at least part of that money is that local governments can use it to stimulate business development to try to come back. So there are a lot of moving parts, totally.
And the state's enacted budget has special funding set aside for restaurants and entertainment venues as well. Mike, you had your hand up.
Yes, remember the earlier money that came to TC3 from the stimulus bills, a lot of that was targeted for student aid, not necessarily something that the college could do for its operation.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the questions. We just don't know.
Yeah, and as far as this last point that was just made about a lot of restaurants closing, they aren't going to come back, a lot of them. The question is whether they'll be able to start up again. We just lost the Queen Diner in Dryden, so that's been there for 20 years. So.
I know.
Well, the question really is and there's an ED collaborative meeting this on Thursday where they're going to talk about this. And I think other conversations are going on. The question is, what would it take and I don't have the answer, what would it take to get those businesses back, or other entrepreneurs who are ready to dive into that business? What would they need to take over those spaces, perhaps? The market is there. It's going to come back. It's an important part of our economy.
Well, the good news, Ronnie told me today he was reading something in local media that Just a Taste was closed only temporarily because the building needed, I don't know, whatever. It's good to know Just a Taste is coming back. So, any other thoughts on this list of goals, or do you think this is enough to keep us busy?
Deborah, if I may, something we talked about 2 years ago, and Glenn, I think, would probably remember this, was that we really wanted to look seriously at recruitment and retention, particularly retention of employees. We may have, we may be able to expand our employment for diversity and inclusion, but we need to be able to make sure that folks that come in are welcome and they stay here and move their careers here. And I know last year, maybe it was 3 years ago, Glenn, you may remember more than I, but we kind of got sidetracked because of COVID. We really couldn't get into that. But I really think that that's an area that our committee ought to look at.
So you want to examine
what we're doing and how we can improve retention of new employees.
Okay. So possible incentives to retain employees.
Particularly recruit and retain,
Okay, I will add that.
Thanks.
Or maybe when we look at the demographics of county workforce, I remember in past reports, there would always be reasons that people, the turnover of stats. I mean, when people left and exit interviews. So it'd be important to know, that's the point of asking, having those exit interviews and see when we've got the climate surveys going on too, that's real important data in identifying retention opportunities.
So we do, I assume, have an exit interview with every employee who leaves, right? And where does that data go?
Oh, hold on a minute. They are given the option of an exit interview with HR. I'm not sure how extensive an exit interview is done with each department, but when we receive the notification that they're leaving, we give them an option of an in-person or a form to fill out with HR. I've looked at a few of those and the data is kind of skippy, so it's not really reliable. We'd have to put in some different processes to make sure that it's reliable data that we can count on, because not everyone is taking advantage of that opportunity.
Is it possible that somebody from HR can go to all of the exit interviews with the department heads? Is that asking?
They notify us electronically, and HR sends an email to the actual employee, and the employee is given that option. I'm not sure exactly what they are doing by departments. Maybe we should find out. And I don't know if there's a form that they fill out.
Some are doing it and some aren't.
Yeah.
Well, you can't develop any kind of plan
Right.
or effective policy to improve retention if you don't know why you're losing people.
Right. And then you think about it too, a lot of people I've noticed, we require a 10-day notice if you're receiving your terminal pay. That really doesn't matter to some people. They'll give notice today and they're gone tomorrow. And sometimes I'm not sure how reliable the exit interview information is, because really you only hear from those who have something really negative to say, and you're not really sure if it's the full story. In fact, it's not the full story. So And a lot of that you'll have to investigate, and it'll be after the fact. So we need to come up with a quantifiable way to get reliable data from exit interviews.
So I guess that should be the starting point, how to get reliable data from departing employees. All right. I think we've put our finger on a problem. All right.
Deborah?
We'll have to massage that one. Martha, your hands up?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first started looking some years ago at the demographic data of our workforce, we were especially trying to identify, like, really trying to make sure. I understand exit interviews can be very sensitive. It may be fine. I've always been planning to retire, or I can't stand my boss anymore, or anything else in between. So it's sensitive. There are a lot of reasons people may not want to bother. But I think we really had and made an effort, at least with diverse employees who left, to try to find. We had so few, it was really painful to have people leave. And so I think we really tried especially hard to follow up with those individuals. So it may be that it's important to prioritize. If we can't really have that kind of sensitive conversation with every person who leaves, maybe at least prioritize the underrepresented folks among the workforce.
Okay, this is going to obviously be a lot harder, and that's probably why we haven't been able to do it so far, but we'll work on it this year.
One thing I might add too, for our Chief Equity and Diversity Officer has been really instrumental. If we notice a problem or something is brought to our attention, she's meeting one-on-one with employees. And maybe that's a step that would prevent the exit. She's really been proactive in that. So, even we may look at exit interview information, but we also need to look at steps and mentoring and following along with new hires to make sure they don't get to that point.
So we should get Deanna involved.
She will kill me, but yes, it's another thing. But
we won't tell her it was your fault.
Oh, it's okay. She does it to me, so I'll do it to her.
That's
she does it to all of us, so.
She does it all the time, but she's doing that already. So she may have some ideas about how to prevent, especially if we're talking about our minorities or diverse candidates, how to prevent them from getting to that step.
That's really the goal. That's
the goal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rather than an exit interview,
right.
How to stay. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, I'll try to work on that one and then get the list out to all of you. And I guess we know what we're doing for the rest of the year. So with that, we need a motion to go into executive session to discuss a particular employee. Can I get a motion? Richard moves and Martha seconds. Mike, are you in favor?
Yes.
Martha?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Let's see, I guess
Ruby and Amy can stay.
Ruby and Amy can stay. All right, and Kathy, we won't be taking any action, so I will simply tell you when the meeting adjourns.